Hey there, guys. My name is Val, and I am the Advancement and Communications Associate at the Domestic Abuse Project. And I'm here with two of our DAP program supervisors who are also therapists. If you guys want to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, my name is Sadie Cunningham. I'm the supervisor of the Intervention and Prevention Program and also a social worker and therapist.
My name is Naajee Dennis. I'm the supervisor of the Victim Survivor Program and the youth program at DAP, and I am also a licensed clinical therapist.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about depictions of healthy, unhealthy, and abusive relationships in media and how those depictions shift over the course of time depending on the social climate and what's kind of going on politically, and how media informs our perceptions and core beliefs. So let's go ahead and just start by kind of setting a baseline of what makes relationship healthy versus unhealthy versus abusive. So from a therapist's perspective, if either of you want to speak on that, what are some kind of like red flags you look out for in your clients when you're thinking of relationships on the spectrum?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm looking for mutual respect. I'm looking at power dynamics, if there's an unequal balance of power within the relationship that's being leveraged, certainly through like a pattern of behavior, then I would classify that as abusive. Unhealthy behaviors I would look for is just like lack of boundaries, lack of communication skills, maybe just like high conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also like even just looking for like that these things can look so complex and often can meld. There can be unhealthy dynamics within a healthy relationship at times too. Mm-hmm. And how open are both partners to starting to look at those unhealthy dynamics and making change and concerted effort to change those behaviors within the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those are all really solid points. And I think, of course, it depends on the person. So let me ask this. How can having an unhealthy relationship dynamic impact the other facets of a person's life negatively? Why is this so important?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think nothing happens in a vacuum, right? So, and we all are relating with people all the time, right? So if we're having a breakdown at home within like a communication or boundaries issues, that takes a toll on your spirit, it takes a toll on your mindset. And so it's going to play itself out in the other relationships you have. So that might be the relationship with your children, the relationships with your family, the relationships you have with coworkers, and ultimately the relationship you have with yourself. Mm-hmm. And how you start to see yourself in a different way based on the breakdowns that are happening within an unhealthy relationship, and then it becomes even more severe when that relationship is abusive.
So I guess my next question going off of that point is, how do you think media informs the ways in which people show up in relationships? Do you two think that media really makes an impact, or do you think it is something that isn't as relevant as people think?
Yeah, I would say the impact is pretty profound from media. We don't have good preventative, like social emotional tools that are taught at an early age. And so we're often looking to relationships experiences in our life and in media to like navigate how to show up in a relationship. And so unfortunately and fortunately at times there is a reliance on the media and what we see to help inform us of like what is a way to handle a conflict, or what are certain beliefs that we carry that might show up in the relationship or kind of impact the way we show up with others or have expectations of others.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find that art is often just a way of expressing what's happening in the world. And so within media, within music, within books, these are just people who are operating within the world and creating based on what they've seen in their environments. And so often it's hard to imagine something new that you haven't seen. So thinking about like songs that don't maybe necessarily age well now, that are creepy crawly and you're like, what? But in that time period, that was what was normal. That was the norm of how to relate to one another. So I think part of the media is we don't have a lot of cross-cultural conversations in media. So it's one perspective. And then that one perspective becomes the dominant perspective. So there might be lots of different ways people are relating in relationships that don't actually, in positive ways that are not relayed in our media. Yeah. It might be seen as like, oh, that's strange that you're a stay-at-home dad, right? And so like, but in a different culture, in a different family system, that's perfectly normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think are some of those false myths and narratives that are being depicted in that cross-cultural conversation you're talking about, do you think that people have this preconception about one idea of who is experiencing domestic violence, and do you think other groups are kind of being ignored in the media?
Absolutely. I think often, especially women of color, aren't seen as victims in domestic violence because of the way they show up in that relationship, right? And especially for like Black women or even Latino women, and being depicted on screen as very aggressive or boisterous. And then we have this idea in the media that a victim only looks submissive. She only looks terrified in the way of her body language, rather than that fear can also show up in ways that looks more big and more resistive to the violence that they're experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is completely true. And I think that's a really good way to kind of get in the next part of our conversation. Is we've discovered that clearly media has a huge impact, not only on the ways that people develop their own personal core beliefs, but the ways that other people see these groups as a whole. And I feel like that probably these tropes and myths we see probably transcend even into the legal system, and that help that these folks are able to access. So it seems like it's really, really impactful in all facets. So let's go ahead and unpack a few examples of healthy, unhealthy, and abusive relationships in popular TV shows and media that we've seen that kind of inform these social perceptions we've been discussing. So maybe we could start with abusive to kind of end on a more positive note. So are there any shows that y'all have seen that you think depict abusive relationships? And I think like another point about this conversation is whether or not you think the viewer is like meant to root for the relationship or not. So I think a show can depict an abusive relationship, but we know as viewers this is supposed to be abusive and this person is experiencing like, you know, this is the central conflict of the show. But there are shows where there are abusive relationships depicted, but like we're supposed to root for that couple to work it out in the end, you know. So I think kind of getting into that, if you guys have any examples of those shows.
Yeah. I would say a recent book and now movie in the pop culture is It Ends With Us. And I think that movie does a great job of depicting like generational abuse and how impactful that can be on witnessing domestic violence and then maybe experiencing domestic violence in adulthood, if that was your early childhood experience. I would say that movie really only depicts overt like physical violence, and I wonder if the physical violence was removed from that movie, if the like emotional abuse or the psychological abuse pieces, the audience would be able to see that. Similar to what Naajee was speaking on earlier, as far as like who is the common victim that we see. Blake Lively plays the victim in this movie. She's obviously a white woman, and so I think it depicts like one experience of victimhood around DV, but not necessarily everybody's experience of DV. And you mentioned earlier, like how does that shape the courtroom, right? There are many conversations that we have in advocacy or as therapists working in the DV world of one person's experience of like coercive control or psychological abuse isn't necessarily another person's. And so there could be psychological abuse playing out in a courtroom that everybody else wouldn't be privy to or aware of except for the person who's experiencing it. And so I wonder like how that would show up in media without having to rely on only physical violence to give the message that domestic violence is taking place.
I think of the show Suits and Harvey and Donna's relationship, and that they've had a romantic relationship in the past, and it's not as like overt. It's more psychological and emotional, and a lot of like intimidation, and in ways that you do root for them to be in the couple at the end, and that there's a lot of pressure put on her by his like behaviors, by the things that he says, for her to take care of his emotions, right? And so, and when he falls apart, she takes responsibility for that rather than him taking accountability for his behaviors, his emotions, and how he shows up. And I think we see that a lot in DV relationships, where the partner who's experiencing the abuse is like, well, I just shouldn't have done that. Like, oh, that if I had responded differently, they wouldn't respond that way. And so a lot of the times that's what I'm listening for is there a level of unjustified guilt that this other partner is experiencing? And also I think that show does a great job of showing like the nonverbals of domestic violence and abusive behaviors and tactics, of the eye contact that doesn't stop. Or being able to control somebody that they're so much so that they're not in the room with you and they're still willing to corroborate lies for you. And become basically a part, they're the puppet to their puppet master. And then seeing how that also plays out in how he relates to everybody else in his life too. And he more so is more physically aggressive with men than he is with her. But the tie that she has, and she's been the one who's been around the longest, and has tried to leave the job relationship, but is consistently pulled back in because of this false idea of, oh, well, he had a hard life, so that's why he treats me this way. And we hear that a lot. With that unjustified guilt of it's my responsibility to take care of this person's emotions.
And rationalizing their behavior.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And I think like another point to that is like when we watch a show and we're meant to kind of like root for two characters, because it's like we have a couple different options of like what way a plot can go. Is like either we have a protagonist and an antagonist, or we have like two characters who kind of have their own journeys. And I think it's like really difficult to kind of humanize a character like that and make people want to like root for the relationship in the end while also like displaying these behaviors. And I think it kind of like in the end justifies it in the way that like just the narrative is depicted. Yeah, I think an example I've seen of some really abusive relationships is Sex and the City, which is one of my favorite shows. And I recently saw a clip on TikTok that I didn't realize just how bad that scene was until I saw it again out of context. Because so basically Carrie is having an affair with Mr. Big, who has a wife, and he like grabs her and he forces her into an elevator and keeps kissing her, and she's like stop. Watching that out of the context of the show, I'm like, this is like sexual assault, right? But when I was watching it in the context of the show, I didn't get that impression the first time I watched it because of the history and the ways in which they've kind of depicted the relationship dynamics between the two of them. But I think when you're looking at any situation, when somebody is telling them to stop, you know, like committing some kind of like physical act on you, that is an act of sexual assault and a violation of autonomy. But, you know, again, we're meant to root for Carrie and Mr. Big at the end, which is really frustrating. So I guess let's move into unhealthy. There are shows that kind of depict relationships that are healthy, but that have unhealthy behaviors. And then there are shows that depict relationships where the two in the show just maybe never end up on the same page. And like we're wanting them to, but like it just never ends up working out. But they don't necessarily have like overt abusive behaviors that involve, you know, invading somebody's autonomy or coercing someone or like holding power. So do you guys have any good examples for that kind of dynamic from TV and movies and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think about the show Abbott Elementary, and the relationship between Janine and Tariq, in that it's not necessarily abusive, and that there's not necessarily this like power dynamic that he's leveraging, but there's more of this. There's lack of reciprocity in the relationship, and so Tariq is kind of ends up taking on a lot of the things that Janine has, right? So like her car, right? So she doesn't have control of her car anymore because he needs something. There's a scene where she's so hungry and she has this like sandwich in her hand, and they're in the car and he's like, oh yeah, I'm hungry too, and takes the sandwich, right? The intention was not to like do her harm, right? It wasn't like planned out. I have this idea, there's this pattern of behavior that I'm going to intentionally do her harm to make her feel smaller than me. Right. And that's where abuse is. When it's unhealthy, it's more of just like, I'm just that's inconsiderate of you. Like I was just really just stuck in that I'm hungry too, and you had that right there, and you're offering it to me because you have limit. You don't have strong boundaries for what you want for yourself, right? And so that where that comes in, that unhealthy dynamic of, oh, Janine should have set some limitations around her own boundaries, right? Of, hey, these are my things, and this is what I want and desire and I need. And he should have had more understanding of, I should be considerate of my partner and what their needs are. And so that piece of like equality and conversation around how do we both need to show up in this relationship so that both people can feel whole in the relationship.
Yeah. I think that's a really awesome point. So what kind of like stuck out to me in that was, do you guys think that the difference between abusive and unhealthy is like a knowing like desire to harm, like a conscious desire to like harm and control?
Not always. I don't necessarily think that everybody who uses abusive behavior has like a malicious, well thought out plan or like some overt intent. Sometimes it does take some exploration of like, what are those core beliefs that you hold in the relationship? And so that's not always conscious to people, but certainly it usually is rooted in like a need for control within the relationship that lacks that mutual respect or reciprocity. And so that it's kind of like my needs are more important than the other person's, or I'm kind of just like careless about this. I think the biggest thing that makes it abusive is it's a pattern of behavior where that is shown, whereas like an instance of just showing up in an unhealthy way.
That makes sense.
Yeah, because inevitably there's like always going to be power imbalances within relationships, but it's really the way that that's leveraged and how often that's showing up. Like, what's the frequency? What's the intensity? What does that look like?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for kind of clearing that up for me. Do we have any other examples of kind of those unhealthy behaviors that aren't really displayed on a pattern, but just have kind of happened occasionally within relationships in media, or should we move on to healthy?
I think if we want to stay on the topic of Abbott, we could talk about Janine and Gregory.
Yeah.
A little bit of a spoiler for those who might not all the way be caught up.
Yeah.
But
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
But I think that it's a great example of a healthy relationship. There's still like some of the like coyness, I feel like, in the initial phase of them. Like we both maybe like have something for each other. There's a little bit of interest there, and it's not like overtly communicated, but it's not done in an unhealthy way. Both of them are able to get their needs met, it seems. They're able to like work through conflict and discomfort. And so I really love watching that. I think it's pretty popular right now, and I wish that there was more conversation online just about their relationship and like that healthy depiction.
Yeah, I would even say like talking about like going back to kind of like the sexual aspect. One, I think in American culture, when we see sexual scenes, it always comes with aggression prior, and I think that's really interesting because I don't think that's true for every community and culture. So it makes you think of the remake of the Baby It's Cold Outside song by John Legend and Kelly Clarkson, which is really shifting that song that was kind of really talking about kind of coercive behaviors and sexual advances at somebody who was a lot younger than you. And so their take on the song talks more about consent and communication. And when she's saying, well, I should probably go, and he's like, I respect that, right? My parents are going to worry. Why are you still living at home? Like starting to ask more of those questions and breaking down some of that very normalized objectification of women. And him continuously being like, yeah, you should leave. Yep, I called your ride. This is who your ride's going to be. And the sense of like consent is continuous throughout the song, rather than in the past with that song, the consent was not there at all.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, we actually had a interview recently with a musician who did a similar cover to that, and she was talking about how in the original music score, the characters are named Wolf and Mouse.
Oh,
which is really weird, and like definitely speaks to that kind of like power dynamic. Yeah, I think that's really interesting and very relevant for the holiday season. So kind of continuing to talk about healthy relationships, I want to kind of bring up a funny one, which is Bob's Burgers, and I love that show. And obviously it's like a silly cartoon, but it's really interesting how sometimes like the most brainless TV can actually teach you a lot about relationships. Because when I watch that show, I feel like that family is like one of the healthiest depictions of a family I've seen on TV, like in like this decade. And you know, Bob and Linda have an extremely healthy like communicative relationship. They still take space away from each other. They have friends that are independent from each other. other. They're partners in a business, and they're kind of like there to lean on each other for support because they kind of find themselves in like financial predicaments a lot. And then they have like 3 kids who, like, as an autistic person, I would say are like definitely like 3 little autistic kids who just have like the most like awesome dynamics with their parents. So I think that that's one example of like a healthy show that I've seen that has really resonated with me. If you guys have any other examples, I think Abbott is also a great one.
Yeah. The final one I would say is Nobody Wants This. Also becoming more popular, I believe, on Netflix, and just offers an opportunity for viewers to like really look at a relationship where people are willing to like grapple with the nuances and like move through conflict in a way that, like, again, not avoiding discomfort, but willing to like kind of talk it through and account for like old stuff that shows up in relationships, because that is something that sometimes we're not always prepared for, and can't necessarily completely avoid in new relationships. And so I think that's a really awesome example too of a healthy relationship. And again, these conversations are just so important to keep having so that we can practice that critical thinking piece when it comes to different relationship dynamics.
Yeah, 100%. I think we had some really great examples of shows and did a really awesome analysis on all of them. So the last question I want to ask is how people are kind of drawn to like toxic like depictions because they're interesting and they're like there for the drama. So do you guys think that people are drawn to unhealthy relationships in the media for that reason, because they find interest in like the conflict? And do you think that there are like times where people like stray away from shows that have healthier depictions because they find it boring just because of the way that they've been conditioned?
I think a lot of things we're drawn to is because of our social construct and what we've experienced throughout our life. So if there's things that we live in an environment in a society that's extremely violent, and so the media, how we relate to each other, we can look at traffic, like the things that we allow and we think is acceptable, and when we're driving a car and how we talk to another person and dehumanize the person in traffic, right? So I think a lot of this is like our core beliefs that we don't pause long enough to really start to dissect of what did I learn growing up? Where did I learn these things? And how do they move me forward or hold me stuck in the same position? And discomfort is hard to face. And so I think often people are drawn to what they're used to. And so if I'm used to this, at least I know this level of intensity. I don't necessarily know what that healthier side could look like and what things I might have to sacrifice in the process of getting to a healthier version of myself and who deems what's healthy, right? And so a lot of the times I think we don't challenge people long enough to start to dissect themselves, and we want to give them answers, and we often are looking for quick hacks on how to be healthier versions of ourselves. But it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort to sit back and pause and be with me and go, ooh, I show up unhealthy in this relationship like this, with this person, that I don't show up the same way when I'm at work or when I'm with this particular family member. What's that about? I don't know if we're moving into healthier territory. I think we're trying. I think that still there's voices that are silenced, so we can't move in a healthier way until we actually address oppression. And that dating violence and interpartner violence and community violence is all an act of oppression. And as Americans, we don't want to face that. We don't want to face how we got to this point. And until we look at that, none of our media can move, because we're just putting Band-Aids over gunshot wounds and we're going to bleed out.
Well, thank you guys so much for sticking with us through this video podcast. And thank you guys for sharing your wonderful thoughts on the matter and educating me and everyone else out there. And we'll see you guys for the next DAP podcast in the future.